Everyone get your camera faces ready. All right. So this is February's panel on reduced inequalities. We have with us Dr. Fatnassi, Dr. Eloundou, and Dr. Eizadirad. Yes.
Good.
Starting with Dr. Fatnassi, I will go ahead and mute my mic and share my screen.
Cool.
Please let me know if you can't see my screen for some reason.
I think we have to give it a second, but cool. All right. So, yes, hi, my name is Dr. Aziz Fatnassi, and I'd like to talk to you today about social distance, social movements, intersections, positions, and precarity. It's a mouthful, but I promise we'll get somewhere meaningful rather quickly. So let's start with the definition of sociability. And I'm going to go through these kind of quickly, and I don't know if Kelsey's able to get to that slide, but hopefully it will work.
Do you see me presenting the presentation?
Yep. I think the next one, if you're able to advance the deck. Well, that's okay. I can go there. So sociability essentially is the ability of individuals to interact and have some kind of social relationship, which could be spontaneous, organized, supportive, conflicting, instrumental, or gratifying. And this can take shape in a number of different ways. So what is open sociability? Well, essentially a space of open sociability is a space where individuals and groups can establish multiple kinds of relationships or connections with others without excluding the ability of multiple other users to establish strong relationships and connections. And you might think of this as a utopia. Yes, utopia is definitely a place where everything is good. Dystopia is a place where everything is bad. What I guess I'm talking about here is heterotopia, right? Especially in the instance of inequalities, I think it's important to understand that we don't live in utopias or dystopias. We live in places where things are different, right? Where members are forging connections kind of ad hoc. So we'll move forward to the next slide. There are a number of different places, like I said, that you can engage in this stuff, and you probably do it every day in kind of forming the relationships in the communities you're a part of. So event spaces, journeys, transactions, social institutions, associations, interest groups, conflict spaces, social processes. But for the purposes of this discussion, I want to focus on public spaces and digital spaces. So I'll move forward a bit here. There are ways in which this plays out in the real world, right? So it's not just a theoretical construct. This is an image rather from the 2008 Greek demonstrations against police violence. I think one of the main discussions now that's occurring, especially around inequality, is police violence. But in this instance, riots started on the 6th of December 2008 when a young 15-year-old Greek student was killed by special officers in a district of Athens. And this kind of exacerbated existing issues around employment, economic crises, and led to a number of deaths and a large amount of violence. We can also think about this outside of physical violence. So that 2008, you might have, well, if you recall this, young students, the financial crises, the global meltdown, as it were, right? Well, it wasn't just a trauma of physical proportions. It was also a trauma of economic proportions, right? Here's a piece representing that trauma, Maurizio Catalan's 2010 Statue of Love, which stands for Freedom, Hate, Vengeance, and Eternity. And this is actually in a really interesting place. It's between the, I believe, Borsa Italiana, the Italian stock market, and the financial minister's office. So every day when these people go into their buildings to do their job, they're reminded of the public's opinion of what they could possibly do, right? But I digress. My interest really in my research focus is around the Arab Spring revolutions. And one thing that I noticed, especially in my research, was how public spaces were used to engender movements to arrest inequality. So this is Tahrir Square, for example, in Cairo, before an official protest took place. And this is Tahrir Square after, right? So you can see how this space was completely transformed by people's efforts to achieve sociability. So sociability, like I said, is kind of part of this notion of identity, right? Who are we? Who can we be? And the privileges thereof. So, you can see this in contesting spaces, the right to spaces, even discussions about which genders, ages, ethnicities, sexualities, abilities, or disabilities and social classes are able to engage in spaces. And they might even draw on some kind of creation myth. So here's one example of that. I think you all know this. This is in, I think it's upstate California. No, I'm just kidding. This is Washington, D.C. And this is obviously the National Mall, a space which gets transformed through human sociability into a space of action, right? And I couldn't tell you whose presidential inauguration this was, but the crowd size was enormous. But this isn't just a place for governments and state officials to perform sociability. It's a place for citizens and members of the body politic to perform sociability. You might even think of civil rights movements and the ability of occupying spaces to kind of transform that. But this isn't just a historic thing. It's also something that occurs today. Here's another space for sociability. Those of you who've been to London might recognize it. This is indeed Trafalgar Square. And this is a protest for justice for George Floyd. Just again, kind of demonstrating how open sociability and these ideas of kind of protest can transcend boundaries. We can go to another image of a public space. This one in Germany, right? Again, young people using it as a site of open sociability, reifying this message that Black lives indeed matter. And I can even go kind of closer to home. These are images from Burlington, Vermont. Those of you who are in Burlington have probably seen this. The painting of Black Lives Matter on public streets. The top left one, if I'm not mistaken, is in front of the state capitol. The one on the bottom is the process of being painted in Burlington, which is the largest city in the state. And like I said, I don't want to spend too much time on this initial part, but youth, it seems today, are seeking a better life, right? They want adequate material resources, physical health and safety, family and social relations, and they want aspiration, opportunity, dignity, and fairness, commitment to a larger purpose. So, to define these really quickly, aspiration requires a capacity to dream as well as the agency and opportunity to make it real. Opportunity structures, they're connected to the effectiveness of this aspiration and the agency you have to mobilize opportunity structures. Thinking about social norms, legal regulations, market entry mechanisms, right? The will is important, right? You have to want to do it, but there also needs to be a way. And then finally, and this is probably the most important piece of all, larger purpose, right? And I just want to remind you, the KKK had a larger purpose, okay? Larger purposes do not have to be positive. They can be negative. They can be whatever they want to be. Larger purposes simply are meaningful projects, whatever that meaning is, right? And I don't use that example just out of hand. It'll actually come into play a little bit later on. It's at this point that I want to give you a brief introduction to Tunisia. We say in Tunisia that our history is in our hands. In fact, all of you probably are Tunisian. If you take your hands and make them into a butterfly like this, you'll notice that there are some lines, right? One that looks like a straight line, one that looks like an upside down, arrow or carrot, I guess. Another carrot, another straight line. In Arabic, this is 1881. Which is the year that Tunisia became a French protectorate. So if you have 1881 in your hands, congratulations, you're Tunisian. This was a treaty, but it was a treaty by force, right? We often think of these things in the language that they're presented to us. So treaty sounds like it was an agreement. Well, no. What actually ended up happening was the French had just begun their conquest of Algeria, had demonstrated this immense firepower and willful disregard for human life, and came to Tunis with essentially a deal. You have 3 hours to either become a protectorate or we'll do the same to you. And the Bey, hoping to assuage the French and their thirst for land and violence, signed away the country. And this, in essence, laid the groundwork for inequality for the next 75 years. Over these 75 years, French settlers engaged in agricultural colonialism, consuming some of the best lands, in fact, changing the law so that lands were removed from the public trust to benefit things like education, health services, and whatnot, into benefiting economic prosperity for France. They even changed the landscape. So thinking about how they laid their imprint. The next image you'll see is of the Cathedral of St. Louis, actually, interestingly enough, connected to the last crusade. Louis IX was the last crusader to step foot in Tunisia, and actually died on the shores pretty quickly of disease. But the first thing the French did after they took the country over was to build a monument to him. Over this time period, from 1881 to 1956, Tunisia would undergo development plans of 21 different resident generals. Okay, and all of these were in the interest of remaking the country, redistributing labor and capital and infrastructure. And I want to keep you in the mental state of the colonial imaginary, right? All of this was being done in the name of the mission civilisatrice, right? Civilisatrice, right? The goal of making the kind of savage, backwards lands of the Arabs into these progressive places. This is an image of a tourist poster, oddly enough, kind of romanticizing Tunis from a view that actually didn't exist once the French arrived. They actually demolished this forest and turned it into a government building. But I digress. There was obviously protest throughout this time period. Tunisians weren't ones to kind of let the French pull these kinds of games. Tunisian farmers would sabotage harvests in the field. They would go into the cities and cause disturbances there. And this was met with unbelievable force. Now, I'm going to kind of fast forward through the next couple slides. Tunisia essentially is kind of prey to European desires. The mistake of one bey, I believe Sadouk Bey, of signing with the Germans leads to his removal. The French regain power of Tunisia in 1945, and replace the German favoring bey with a French favoring bey, his cousin Lamine, who befriends Habib Bourguiba, one of these young revolutionaries in the early 1900s. Bourguiba eventually takes over, takes on the role of modernizer, seeks out support from Western nations. Here he is courting John F. Kennedy, trying to get money for development, which I believe he successfully did, in exchange for pledging to not support communism. And Tunisians, again, were very active in this discourse. This is 1957, Tunisians protesting the French remaining on a military base in Bizerte. But I digress. The point of this all is that development remained unequal, that Bourguiba essentially was still at the whim of the Europeans in terms of what he developed. Whereas downtown Tunis might have looked like this in the 1970s, most of the country actually looked like this. And you can see the difference in terms of infrastructure, in terms of development, in terms of the ability of individuals to participate in what was a really rapidly changing economy. And this is also reflected in the number of years after Bourguiba, whereas development occurred slowly in the center. On the coasts where tourism was rampant, and I'll talk about that in a second, development increased numerously. So two pictures are being presented of Tunisia, right? This picture of this amazingly developed, modern Western space, replete with all of these kind of Western imaginaries of what the Orient should be, and then the reality which individuals lived in. And during this time, obviously, politics were changing. Bourguiba now was no longer a young man. In 1986, he was in his late 80s, suffering from dementia, falling asleep on national TV while giving speeches. and it was time for a change. Tunisia, of course, was not a democracy, and so that change came in the form of a coup called the medical coup. Here you can see the newspaper from the day after, November 8th, 1987. Mr. Zine Al Abidine Ben Ali, President of the Republic. We are entering together a new era. I feel inspired. I don't know about you. Unfortunately, the development process was exactly the same. Build and they will come. Another tourist complex was built. I think this one, 13,000 rooms for tourists. And this was the model for Tunisian progress, solving Tunisian inequality. And the figurehead for that, of course, was Ben Ali. And his image was everywhere. This is his image for a political campaign on the side of a Spanish fort from the 1500s. This is an image of him in front of the Merchant Marine, in case you forgot, who's your benefactor. And then this is an image of him at a political rally. And again, in case you forgot who was making your life better, the image was there all the time until, of course, it wasn't, right? And 2011, the revolutions happened, Facebook revolutions, democratic revolutions, whatever you want to call them. We won't get into that in this discussion, but essentially Ben Ali was removed, and this structure of development that had been, in pursuit essentially since the French in 1881 was thrown away in the trash, possibly where it belonged, but also possibly not. And everything was great, right? So, Tunisians immediately went out, went kite surfing in the desert, and then they played golf in the amphitheater of Al Jem, and then they went and hung out in the mountains of Tamerza in the spas. Wait, that's not how it went. Because this is actually what most Tunisians lived in. And those spaces that were built and democratized after the revolution, they actually still weren't for Tunisians, right? There was still that level of inequality. At this time, 2013, political assassinations occur. Shukri Balid, a youth-supported political activist, one of the critics of the Islamic government, which took over power after Ben Ali was removed, killed in front of his wife and kids by a young gunman on a moped. A couple months later, Mohammed Brahmi, another politician very much favored by the youth, killed by unknown assailants in the exact same way. And the Interior Minister, Lutfi Benjeddu, tells a news conference, the same exact 9mm weapon used to kill your favorite politician before was used to kill this politician. If you want to add insult to injury, it was another young Tunisian who killed this politician due to his tendencies towards Salafism, or a very restrictive and extreme form of Islam. These murders brought Tunisians back together. So, Tunisians are going to this funeral in Jalaz cemetery, a cemetery for martyrs. They're riled up. The police shoot tear gas at them. They're ready to go and storm the government and bring it down again. And the daughter of Brahmi, Belkis Brahmi, gets on TV and says, listen, vengeance is not for you. You are not the ones who lost your father. I lost my father, right? For you to fix this, you need to go out and participate in politics, participate in the discussion, right? Don't resort to the violence that led to the death of the person that I loved the most, right? Tunisian society kind of gets into this, this act, right? The labor union kind of throws in their weight, the industry of trade and handicrafts, the Tunisian Order of Lawyers, they all come together and essentially say, if you want to be a political player in Tunisia, you need to sign a document that says your party will not engage in political violence, right? It was a way to allow for dissent and this open sociability without encouraging violence. And I realize I'm getting close to my time here, so I'm going to move forward past these next few slides. There's a constitution in 2014. There continue to be some terrorist attacks, Bardo Museum, Port Kantawi, again, tourist sites, keep that in mind. And if we look at how these kind of all play out on a map, people who are committing these acts of terrorism, people who are joining ISIS, are coming from these disadvantaged, economically, inopportune places. And they're also committing acts of protest. So, I won't dive too deeply into what that means, but it points to the fact that youth activism is definitely a mechanism for social change. Like I said in the beginning, both good and bad. Keep in mind, the person who killed Muhammad Ibrahimi, young person, right? The people went out in the streets on the 11th, of January 2011. Young people, right? And it makes me ask this question: if we're talking about reducing inequalities, we're talking about removing the boundaries to meaningful participation, right? Why is it youth that are being asked to lead this charge? Why is it not the people who have been kind of in these spaces for a long period of time? And I think it's for a couple reasons. I think it's for the reason that youth in this contemporary day and age are producers of popular culture. They're also consumers of popular culture. And finally, they're containers for popular culture. The two images on the screen represent, I think, the extremes of what most of the non-youth world sees youth as. The first is this one on the right, Mohamed Bouazizi, which some people called the spark of the revolution, literally ignited himself on fire in protest of injustices committed against him. And on the left, we see young Tunisian protesters who are wearing a shirt that says, "No, we will not forgive," with regards to corruption and economic malfeasance, right? And these are the two extremes. Like, you're peaceful and you're out in the streets, or you're violent and you literally set things on fire. And I think this happens through a couple different mechanisms. So Bouazizi, just to kind of go through his story really quickly, didn't graduate from high school, didn't really have the ability to, become proficient in Western style activism, didn't really have the networks to empower himself. But others who have gained a voice and, have managed to escape that cycle of inequality, they have access to these literacy spaces, right? This one here on the left, Labes, which is actually a space to kind of design your own NGO. And on the right, language schools and international educational organizations, right, which provide connections and allow you to make networks between other activists. Also, cafes. Cafes are super important in Tunisia. You're going there, you're listening to the discourse of your colleagues and friends, you're sharing a laptop and internet access, which oftentimes is really expensive for you to get on your own. And you're able to practice the forms of, if I go to the next slide, you're able to practice the forms of resistance that are most effective in your generational cohort, right? So I showed you the images in the beginning of this presentation of all of those analog, physical, real world spaces, right? This is where I think the discourse is shifting. I don't think that the Arab Spring was the beginnings, or necessarily was like driven by technological affinity space or literacy spaces, but I think it's changed how Arab youth have started to speak about inequalities, right? And that's for a simple reason. It recreates effective discourse. If you see someone succeeding in a discourse against inequality, right, and that platform is digitized, you now can watch that as many times as you want. You can recreate that discourse yourself. And quite frankly, you can learn how to integrate your activism with a broader audience and a broader goal. Again, remember what I said about larger purpose. And, I'm going to conclude with the next slide, but thinking about connecting even your ideational conception of inequality. Here is an example from Mimak Ogilvy, Association des Femmes Tunisiennes Démocrates, put together this amazing ad, which, lambasted violence against women. And it's a woman, image speaking with a man's voice, saying all these very patriarchal things about a woman's role. It's things like this that are changing in the political discourse, and it's largely because of this shift in spaces of open sociability. So I want to conclude with this this point, and I hope it connects to what my colleagues here are going to talk about in a second. But I feel like we're in an age where new slogans are about something different, right? It's not just freedom or all of this stuff. It's a very specific thing that people want. Equitable distribution of wealth, defeating nepotism and corruption, freedom of expression and assembly, right? And at its heart, dignity. So I want to end my discourse here just by asking you all to think about in your own lives the ways in which you engender dignity, right? And the ways in which you feel as though this dignity is either supported or, obfuscated or removed by the political system that you're a part of. And I want you to think about what the limits are that you would go to make sure that your voice was heard. And with that, I end my presentation.
Elsie, you're on mute.
Of course I am. Thank you, Dr. Fatnassi. Who would like to follow right after that one?
I can go. I think there'll be some connections.
All right. Do you want to try sharing your slides, or do you want me to pull them up?
Yeah, I'll try. Let me give it a try first. So present now. My entire screen. Can you see my slides now?
Yep.
All right, great. Well, thank you for that. Lots of food for thought, and I think there'll be some great connections. I always like to begin by situating myself as well. So I was born in Iran, and I immigrated to Canada, to Toronto, Canada in 1998, and I've been here kind of ever since. But my position coming into the topic for today's presentation was kind of looking at how do we understand systemic racism and what is its role in trying to create equitable outcomes as a process for reducing inequalities. So I kind of begin with this picture of, you've probably seen it. It's very common if you ever kind of taken a course looking at equality or social issues, but, equality in one word being sameness, equity in one word being fairness. And then most recently, we start to see the liberation picture where we want to break the fence, which represents systemic barriers. I want to put a question out. In order to be equitable, we need to know something. And I always use a map analogy. In order to read a map, if you're lost somewhere, what do you need to know? Does someone just unmute and shout? Because I can't see everyone. Any guesses?
Where you are?
Where you are. Exactly. If you don't know where you are, it does not matter how great looking that map is and all the great information. So the analogy I use is in order to be equitable, we actually have to be able to identify the needs of whether we're talking about specific individuals, social groups, or countries, and we have to agree on it, or else we are going to kind of go in different directions, right? So if I said that, and it's important to have specific conversations. If I said, do we need change? I think everybody in this room agrees. Now, if I said, how do we need, what kind of change do we need? How do we implement it? We're not going to agree on that necessarily. And it's going to be a much more complex conversation. And I think that's the stage we're at, that to the prior presentation is, we know we need change, but exactly what kind of change? How do we mobilize? How do we strategize? And I think that's important in order to reduce inequality. So my research kind of, in a sense, it's all over the place, but it's always under the umbrella of equity, social justice, and inclusion. For a long time, I was researching the school system, particularly the early years. I looked at this impact of standardized testing on racialized students and how harmful it is, as well as in other sectors like kindergarten. And how do we take up race? How do we not take it up? How do we try to create a neutral, apolitical space when in fact neutrality itself is a stance? Neutrality benefits the oppressor. So how do we actually disrupt what is normalized? I say there's no such thing as common sense, because that's always relative. What you think is common sense, I take you to another country and you do that exact same thing, it can get you killed. So it's always a push and pull, and that's what I mean by it's relative to context. So going back to this picture, that fence represents the isms that we're trying to break down in order to achieve equality of outcome, right? Whether we're talking about across social groups or countries, right? So what are some of these isms? Of course, you got ageism, racism, sexism, heteroism. sexism, and so forth, right? You can think of it from a range of axes of difference. But then again, we have to be specific. So, most people right now in the world, due to the, George Floyd's deaths, the rise of Black Lives Matter movement, they want to portray multiculturalism within different spaces, right? What does that mean? Okay, we want representation from different identities and social groups. But that could be performative. That could be tokenism, right? Just because it looks multicultural doesn't mean the power dynamics are inclusive. And we see this when many racialized students who get accepted to elite schools, who predominantly have Eurocentric practices, they ended up leaving the school because they have to justify how they dress, how they talk, how they do their hair, right? All these impacts your experience within spaces. And so we can't just say, we're going to have a day, bring your culture food, bring your culture clothes. We're going to, dance and celebrate. And all the other days, we're back to usual. So to be equitable, we actually have to change the power dynamics of our institutions, including many post-secondary institutions, which are still very rigid, very resistant to change, and very colonizing in their practices, even working from within an institution myself, right? And coming from Canada, I mean, people think there is no issues here, like everything is happy and jolly. Okay, so there is a big range of inequality and inequities within Canada itself, right? Just to give you some examples, this slide and next slides is, if you have a African, Asian, or Muslim sounding name, you are likely not to get a call for a job interview, all right? Here's some other examples of systemic racism, particularly impacting racialized identities. And when I say racialized, people who are in the non-dominant group, right? Whether we're talking about race, whether you could talk about sexuality and gender, right? Immigrants' credentials and work experiences are often undervalued or devalued, right? Many immigrants have degrees, but they're not getting the equivalency when they immigrate to another country. Racialized people actually have a higher representation in the workforce, but then when we look at what kind of jobs they do, it's often part-time and precarious due to these systemic barriers. So next time you're on campus, I want you to think about who's the janitor, who's working at the coffee shops, and start noticing who is impacted by these and who is getting certain opportunities and who is not. So kind of coming back, inclusion is more than literally being included in the story, right? Like you can have a seat at the table, but that's the start of the battle. That's not the end line. When we get there, now what? How do we change the power dynamic so we're not using deficit thinking? And deficit thinking blames individuals, their way of being, and their culture for their failure, right? It's like, if you don't do good in your class, well, you didn't study hard enough, you didn't work hard enough, you're a failure, try again. But it could be a range of other things that impacted you, right? It could be intergenerational trauma. It could be that you can't access a tutor as you have to work 2 jobs. So it's much more complex, and we have to disrupt deficit thinking that is often rooted in our educational practices. Inclusion is about belonging and feeling like you are valued for who you are and your ideas and your experiences. So how do we create that? And, I use this cartoon that said, for a fair selection, everybody has to take the same exams. Unfortunately, this is many of our educational institutions still operate under, when we know, we have to consider factors like students' preferred learning style, access to services. The pandemic has, of course, made the access to mental health and support services a really important topic to continue to talk about. Access to even technology, who can come on these events, come on Zoom calls to continue their learning, who can afford to have their cameras on when you're in class and who cannot, due to having many people live in the same household or having to share the same space. So there's a lot of things that relate to the equity piece, right? So I kind of use this wheel of power and privilege to deconstruct how we can try to be more inclusive and how to disrupt the normalizing gaze. Different aspects of your identity privilege you and others oppress you. Nobody is always oppressed and nobody is always the oppressor. That's binary form of thinking with opposites, which actually reinforces inclusion and exclusion. So anytime someone presents an argument to you in form of a binary, I encourage you to actually say, no, there's a range of in-betweens, right? From this side of the spectrum to that side of the spectrum. And that's important. I recently started adding a word to this power and privilege analogy. I call it now the triple P, and I think it's super relative to what we're talking about today. It's power, privilege, and driven by profit, especially when we look at history. We look at how countries have been exploited, how countries have been colonized, how treaties have been violated, right? It becomes a story of power driven by profit and privilege, right? So just to kind of bring things full circle is we actually need to shift, if we're talking about reducing inequalities, to talk about and apply a social determinants of health perspective in all sectors, even if you're not in the health sector. What does that mean? For example, being sick right now in a pandemic is not whether you're coughing or not, right? That's a very binary, sanitized, linear way of looking at sickness, right? Being sick right now is, looking at your health, it's, can you go outside for a walk? How far is the hospital from your house? Can you go and get your own groceries, or someone has to bring it to you? Who is impacted? Which communities are impacted at a higher rate by COVID? It's the same across the world. Racialized communities are disadvantaged because they have less of an access to social services and support services, right? So think about all these things, even your gender, right? Can you go and see a doctor from the same gender and sexuality or not? These all impact your day-to-day experiences. And of course, different countries have different trajectories when we talk about creating equitable processes and outcomes, but it's anchored also spatially by power and privilege, right? Not everybody's voice is received the same way. Not everybody's vote carries the same weight. And that can be at the micro level, even within a classroom, or on a larger scale when we talk about countries negotiating, right, and histories. So where do we go from here, right? As I said, we all agree we need change, but we need to continuously have conversations and dialogues about what to do, how to do it, when to do it, right? When you talk about navigating power, there has to be strategy, right? You want to strive to be an ally and not a savior, okay? If you say, I'm gonna go another country and help out for a week and come back and feel great, I mean, sure, you might initiate some change, but that's more, it sounds like it's more becomes about you and feeling great. How do we allow countries to become sustainable based on their own local needs, right? If you never watched the documentary Schooling the World, I highly encourage you to watch it. It's accessible for free, just put it on YouTube. Just because we want to create all these great, free education for everybody in the world, by helping out through these big corporations, it actually has driven many communities in other countries to become extinct. There's now a lack of connection between elders and intergenerational knowledge and oral culture being passed down. So those communities have become less sustainable by trying to get everyone to buy into this colonial understanding of Western education, which has historically portrayed itself and ways of being and practices as superior to all other things. So once again, goes back to power and privilege and profit. What comes to you naturally as the normal, quote unquote, in quotations, we have to disrupt that. We need more non-Western knowledge. We need indigenous knowledge. We need African culture. We need multiple perspectives to disrupt this narrative that has become hegemonic, that we don't even question it in many settings because that's always the way it has been. So we need to shift from deficit thinking to strength-based thinking, right? Once again, this is not a binary, right? Think of it as a spectrum. On one extreme end is deficit thinking, very individualistic, neoliberal lens, focuses on the individual. We want to go through strength-based thinking. It focuses on macro causes, on institutions. And I always want to give the example that if institutions want to take credit for your success, so if you do really great, go on, graduate, become an alumni, we want to put you on our website, say we gave you that great education. Well, if that's the case, the other side of the coin is that institutions need to start taking credit for failures of communities, because institutions have largely contributed, whether with intentionality or unintentionally, right? We get to glorify the one success story and say, well, everybody else, if you work hard enough, you can make it too. Look at so-and-so. They came from poverty. They came from a single parent household. You can do it too. That's the neoliberal lens, right? When in fact, actually for every one of those success stories, there was 100, if not thousands of people who are murdered or are in jail, or you never heard their story, but we don't talk about that, right? So kind of bringing back to my research, if I had to talk about the education system and where do we go from here to reduce inequalities, is standardized testing in Ontario, Canada. It was introduced in 1996. So it's not as rich in terms of history compared to the United States. In the United States, we can go all the way back to the rise of IQ testing, which was a construct Eurocentric, which was used to create division between different social groups to justify, you know, if you're European and white, you are going to be the smartest of the smartest. That social construct was created, right? Which then allowed to justify exploiting and colonizing other countries. So in order for you to justify those exploitation and colonization, you have to make a space or a social group feel inferior, right? Propaganda is often used in the process, but it's also media, right? It's also the different outlets that we're talking about and connects to the last presentation. So for me, whether in the United States or in Canada, standardized testing has not contributed to closing the achievement gap. That's what it came in to do, and it continually has failed. So at one point, you say, if this is not working, why do we keep investing millions of dollars? So I argue, and I look at some case studies in Canada, is we actually have to reframe. It's not the achievement gap, it's the opportunity gap we need to close, right? If people are put in a position to get an opportunity and then provided support, mentorship, you know, provided a pathway to succeed, they will likely do well. The achievement gap will naturally close. So instead of focusing on the end, which is we just want the achievement gap to close, we actually have to invest in the process, right? People need glasses. People need to see a dentist. People need to be able to access support services. These are all important, and people have to feel like they belong and are valued. When we look at streaming, it starts from elementary school, right? It starts with negative experiences, people being judged, saying they're not smart enough. They feel like they don't belong there, which can lead to a self-fulfilling prophecy of you believing you're not good enough. And so you're going to try to explore another pathway. We look at who is in our jails. We look at who is dropping out or being pushed out of our schools. It's a very similar, sad story, often racialized identities. And that's not because they don't try hard enough. It's because the system places them along the path of poor conditions, which has a domino effect of most likely not being able to succeed compared to someone else who is in a more privileged position. So I argue that we need to start seeing education as symbiotic with the larger community outside of schools. And when I say schools, it could be, you know, elementary, middle school, high school, post-secondary. What happens outside of school impacts you learning inside school and vice versa. We can't treat them as separate, right? So we have to try to address the root causes of inequality of opportunity that plagues our education system and often marginalize our most vulnerable. We have to create partnerships and collaborations that are synergic, meaning they help each other, right? And we need more partnerships with nonprofits, community organizations, youth activism, local community level partnerships, because what we do has to be social culturally relevant. We can't do this copy and paste approach. If something is best practices, it means it's a great framework. But if I try to take that, if I take a best practice in the most privileged school in Toronto and take it to the hood, take it to an under-resourced community, I guarantee you it's not going to work if I copy and paste it. I can copy, tweak, and try to apply it, and it might work, but we have to stop. And part of it is, you know, on an international scale, you know, PISA testing, where they're trying to rank countries based on how kids do. This is actually adding to the problem. So on an international level, there's lots of fault, and we need to question those practices. Who is it benefiting? Who is considered superior? Who is considered inferior? And it's taken away from what education is really about. You know, going to school is not about getting a job. All right. Back in the day, you went to school, you were guaranteed a job. You no longer need a degree to be successful. You're competing with the world now, and a lot has changed. If I have time, I'll talk about some of those models. I want to be conscious of time, so I'm going to wrap up. Education and quality of education can't be judged exclusively through standardized tests and their quantifiable indicators, because students have to be seen as holistic beings. You have social, emotional, academic, psychological, and even spiritual needs. We need to bring social emotional intelligence. We have to bring spirituality to teachings. And these are often at the core of many non-Western practices. And this is my last slide. You know, our safest schools and work environments are places where there are strong relationships. And if we want to reduce inequality, we have to invest in relationship building. And that means we have to be conscious of history, of colonizing practices, of cultural genocide, and really different access to power, privilege, and profit. It has to be reciprocal. It has to be restorative. It has to be reciprocal, right? And so I leave you with these questions to perhaps discuss or to reflect on. How do you build, support, and maintain strong relationships, you know, in your life with others? It could be as a parent, as a coach, as a teacher. And what are the signifiers of a strong community, right? Think quantitatively and qualitatively. If I walk into a school, I can tell you in the first 10 minutes what level of community is within that space, from how people are talking, the student work being celebrated, whose voices dominate the conversation. Are there outlets for different perspectives, or are people very reluctant to speak against the norm, or else they might be face consequences, right? So think about community through your senses, right? Sight, hearing, smell, taste, and touch. How do you show community in your roles? And that's important. And I will stop there, and I will just leave you with, let me just try to stop sharing. The things you can control, I say 3 things. As you try to build community, are your actions, which is what you do, your inactions, what you choose to ignore, and your reactions. When something happens and shit hits the fan, how you react can be the big difference. So your actions, inactions, and reactions. All right, thank you.
Thank you. All right, Dr. Eloundou, I have your slides up if you want to get started.
Okay, do I move it or do you?
I think you should see it now, or in a second. There it goes.
All right. Hopefully we see the same slide.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, perfect. Well, it's a pleasure to be here. It's always a risk to come after such brilliant presentations. Pretty much some of the themes that are meant to touch upon have already been addressed. So do you see the slide? I can't see the slide actually. Did I stop the sharing, or I don't see my...
I just saw it, but now the screen's black. It says you're still presenting, though.
I think you might need to maximize the window and then it will come back up.
Oh, me or Kelsey?
Whoever's presenting the
Okay,
screen.
except I don't see you. Okay, do you see the screen now, the slides now?
Yep.
Yep.
Okay,
that's
so
supposed to be.
I'll just go under the assumption that, you know, I'm being seen. And so I think it's tough to come after these very strong acts, but it's also an advantage because I can build on some of the themes that I've heard already. I think Dr. Fatnassi's themes of digital space and social movements and youth needing a better future and Facebook revolutions, as well as Eizadirad, sorry, touching on many themes that I think I'm going to be front and center in my remarks, including sort of the lack of consensus of what needs to change, questions about the sort of deficit thinking, the difference between achievement gaps and opportunity gaps. So these are questions that I'm going to basically come back on. My talk is going to be less fluid, though. It's going to have a bit of a sort of bullet point quality but hopefully that gives us a few concrete ideas to chew on and to debate. And so, I came with the understanding that we were presenting to sort of students having an interest in understanding some of the debates on inequality and how to reduce this inequality. And with this in mind, I think my opening remarks were first to sort of acknowledge and congratulate students for their interest in inequality, but also to begin with the notion that this concern was about inequalities pretty much shared globally. And you can see this in some of the things that Dr. Fatnassi has talked about, sort of social movements across the world, a slew of literature on the topic of inequality, interest in global politics, including at the UN, where now inequality has been featured as one of the top goals the world should be worrying about. This concern is, of course, justified by statistical evidence of rising inequality across the world. So, in a sense, you have a little bit of the shared concern, but at the same time, there's tremendous polarization and lack of consensus on what inequality is and how to best address it. And so what I'm going to do is just sort of take you through what I see as some of the terms of these debates and the lack of consensus around these points. And these debates actually run the gamut from the nature of inequality itself, what it is. Why should we be concerned about inequality? What are the trends in inequality? Is it actually rising? What are the main causes and what are the promising policies? So essentially on all these points, you really do not have a ton of consensus. You have a very polarized debate. In fact, the debate has been so polarized that Nancy Birdsall has referred to this as a silly debate, where you have two opposite camps, each digging its wheels. On the one hand, sort of the economists and World Bank type and finance ministers who basically tend to see inequality as sort of on the decline, on the wane. And on the other hand, anti-globalist NGOs and sociologists tending to just emphasize a rise in inequality. And so, and these two camps, again, couldn't be more far apart. And so, if we begin to sort of take this lack of consensus or that dissensus piece by piece, and if you think about the importance of inequality, why should we care about inequality? Why some would actually see inequality as a plus, as a necessary spur for innovation and progress. You have a set of arguments that have been developed. And I start from sort of the older arguments that I would call intrinsic argument. In other words, you care about inequality for its own sake because it's something to address, but also you care about it, out of the kindness of your heart because you don't want to hurt the poor, the unfortunate. So this is the humanitarian argument and the moral argument. It's just wrong to deprive sort of the rest of humanity of things that everybody has in overabundance. But now we've moved to a second generation argument that are more about intrinsic and societal argument. And the key here is that we don't just care about inequality for people at the bottom of the socioeconomic ladder. It is not out of our kindness, out of the kindness of our heart, if you are middle class or upper class, it's actually out of self-interest that we should care about, redressing inequality, because it has societal consequences that are going to be felt by the entire society. Whether you're talking about crime, whether you're talking about security, whether you're talking about health, and the current pandemic is a close reminder, you cannot have a substantial portion of your population under dire circumstances without sort of feeling the brush of it. And so this is the sort of the two argument that you're going to see levied, and of course different camps are going to weigh a little bit more heavily on one versus the other side. If we shift to the nature of the argument, I mean, it may actually surprise students of in social science or people who care about inequality that even a lot of professionals social scientists don't really are not clear about what they mean when they're talking about inequality, or if they can measure it. Of course, we can recognize situations of extreme inequality. Everybody can recognize when you have a really desperate cases where you just have massive difference between those at the top and those at the bottom. But in between these extremes, it's actually pretty hard to arbiter and adjudicate between the levels of inequality and the different forms of inequality and which matter and why. Between wealth versus income inequality, between inequality that align on gender, race, and so forth, and the intersection of the above, between inequality, which is typically pegged among the adult population and workers, to actually the more pressing inequality. And I was happy to see the second speaker refer to this, actually the first as well, inequality among youth. It's a little acknowledged fact that if you just took the population of youth, let's say people between the ages of 15 and 29, the levels of inequality among this segment of the population across most countries of the world are actually much higher than those that you find in the adult population, for reasons that I can sort of explain later. But nonetheless, this is not something that is constantly recognized. And so the nature, what we mean by inequality, how we measure it, there's actually surprisingly a lot of debate. And I'm actually going to discuss the trends, and you'll see the same disagreement there. So objectively, if you take the objective definitions and measure, you have disagreement. But they also have sort of a realization that inequality is not just sort of an objective manner. You have to take subjective perceptions, relative deprivation, how people feel relative to the groups that they take as reference. And so here, there's been a tremendous transformation over time in the sense of relative deprivation. Let's say 50 years ago, 70 years ago, relative deprivation was just how deprived you were feeling relative to your immediate neighbor. And sort of the acronym there was just to, everybody was trying to keep up with the Joneses, which were your immediate neighbor. But then with your globalization, the rise of TV, then you start worrying about a neighbor that is not so proximate, somebody who can be distant, but that you can watch on TV. And there's a potential for greater deprivation, because while you were able to keep tabs on your neighbor, you could call their bluff if they kind of overspend just to impress you. You don't quite have the same opportunity to do this with somebody that you see on TV, because you're not proximate. You can just witness their consumption and try to emulate it and not realize if this consumption is based upon real resources or if it's just sort of an empty display. And then things are getting even worse with the social media, where not only does the frequency of comparisons increase, but also the space, the scale at which people are able to compare themselves with people in remote places is increasing. And so the bottom line is that over the years, the potential for relative deprivation, everything else equals, has increased. There are studies that actually show not only a straight but very strong correlation between the amount of exposure to social media and dissatisfaction with one's income and circumstances. Essentially, keeping your resources constant, you're more likely to be deprived if you are made, or if you make yourself to feel that you have less than the person that you see on TV or on social media. And so this is just about the nature. Objectively, there's no consensus on the metrics, and subjectively, there's sort of this greater potential to feel relatively deprived, in part based on the changing nature of our neighbors. Then in terms of the trend, actually, it may seem a pretty simple question that people should agree on. That is to say, is inequality increasing or declining in the world? But you might be surprised to realize that, well, until recently, they didn't really have much consensus. You had, on the one hand, proponents of sort of a flat Earth, in which inequality was described as being actually declining, trending down. The world was flattening. And on the other hand, other scholars actually claiming that we were sort of reaching an era of mass divergence. Okay. Fortunately, here, I mean, there's been a little bit of a consensus. People have converged towards this sort of middle ground position to realize that they were both, in a sense, right. If you look at inequality between countries, things are actually trending down. The countries are coming a little bit closer apart. Countries are converging. Yet at the same time, within individual countries, many countries in the world, levels of inequality are pretty high or rising. And so, in a sense, as long as you care to specify the scale and units of analysis, you can have a story that is a little bit more consensual. Then if we speak about the causes, and then I can just return to the second speaker's remarks, and basically the story here is that there's been a tremendous evolution from personal, individual factors. I think what it was sort of referring to as the achievement sort of story versus the opportunity story. And so if you take the nature versus nurture and structure continuum, we have moved happily from a situation where sort of if you were poor, you were blamed for your poverty. It was either lack of effort, it was sort of lack of skill or lack of innate ability, as opposed to lack of educational opportunities, lack of sort of nurturing and resources within the family, or more importantly, lack of social capital or a good structural environment that makes it possible for you to succeed. And so while we have moved towards the sort of the right and the greater recognition of structure, you still have a little bit of ebb and flow between these two ends of the conceptual spectrum. And then finally, when we think about promising policies, again, here you have just even a sort of a wider range, hard to reconcile. In the 50s, I think most economists at the time believed in a story of self-correcting inequality. And it was, with Kuznets as a proponent, essentially the story was that if you have a country that is growing, you may have a phase of initial divergence and inequality, but you shouldn't worry because eventually everybody catches up and then inequality corrects itself. And so it was a happy story. If you're facing a temporary a situation of inequality, you consider it temporary and just relax because things are going to take care of themselves. At the other extreme end, at least it was an extreme end until sort of a few years back, there was this really pessimistic story about inequalities being essentially intractable, that societies historically have not been able to deal well with inequality. And so the inequality was going to, once it's set in motion, it's going to keep growing until you're going to have some major crisis that would just raise everything and then set the table anew. And so the only remedies to inequality under that sort of previously nightmarish scenario were either state collapse or wars, conflict, or pandemics. Essentially, it was believed that sort of a pandemic would just level everything and then bring everybody to the same position, and then you can start over with from a place of relative inequality. Of course, this story has been is being challenged now, as we see that at least if you take the COVID-19 pandemic as an example, it has really not done much to reduce inequality. It might have, in fact, reinforced it in many ways. And so this leaves us, or that leaves this story with very few remedies to address inequality, dire as the previous remedies were. And so in between these two extremes, you have a sort of a set of possibilities here, moving from a technical to the political on the right, different things that you can try to do to address inequality. And so the theme of my remark, what I wanted to do through this brief presentation, is for a student who is sort of equity-minded, is first of all to basically read broadly, understand what is the nature of inequality, what has been the debates, what are the proposed remedies and their flaws, the counter arguments, before you can engage that debate. I was recently sort of a member of a panel that a UN panel that wrote the sort of recent Sustainable Global Development Report. And one of our findings was that inequality, goal number 10 here, was only one of very few, actually one of two major goals that was trending in the wrong direction. The world has been making some progress in sort of basic human development outcomes, education, a little bit of health here, some aspect of nutrition, and infrastructure. But as far as inequality and the environment are concerned, the world is actually moving in the wrong direction. And I contend that it would keep moving in the wrong direction for two reasons. The first is that if you look at the global mega trend or mega trends in demography across different sections of the world, patterns of fertility, parenting resources, and differences within countries between the rich and poor. If you look at patterns of assortative marriage, if you look at patterns of maternal employment, if you look at patterns of teenage fertility, all of these data, different factors work differently across different regions of the world, but by and large, all of this sort of demographic undercurrent is exerting pressure towards more and more inequality. And so the default here is going to be more, not less inequality. The other reasons why there's urgency in deliberating here is really the need for fresh voices that bridge the gap in thinking between these sort of two opposite views and try to get sort of to a middle ground where people can put together or at least reconcile some of the false dichotomies that are often brought to the fore when you start debating questions of inequality. And I'll stop here. Thank you.
Thank you so much. This time we have about 15 minutes left in our panel, so we'll open it up to questions from the audience. Feel free to raise your hand, speak out loud, or if you want to just pop it in the chat, I can read the questions out loud from there as well.
We may have intimidated my students into silence with our sage words, so we could also converse as well if no comments arise. All right, I'll start us off. I found a lot of connections between all of our presentations. One of the things I think that stuck out to me, and I'm interested to hear everybody else's opinion on this. I believe you said this, Dr. Eizadirad, the notion of neutrality being a stance. And, Dr. Eloundou, you spoke about the progress on these metrics, either being negative or positive. And I'm wondering a couple things. The first is about that stance of neutrality. individually. And the second is, I guess, a question of equity. You know, I don't know if any of you have read Vandana Shiva's book. It just came out, I think, this past year, Oneness versus the 1%. I just want to read you a brief quote, and I think you'll appreciate it. There we go. Being well and the experience of well-being are timeless, off the clock. Wealth means a state of well-being. The market has come between us and our well-being, severing us from our own potential needs. In 2010, 388 billionaires controlled as much wealth as the bottom half of humanity. This number came down to 177 in 2011, 159 in 2012, 92 in 2013, 80 in 2014, 62 in 2016, and it shriveled to a mere 8 in 2017. And in 2020, it seems there will only be 1. So I guess what I'm wondering is, like I was saying with this notion of neutrality being a stance, how many of us have to not be neutral, I guess, or, you know, to counterbalance the neutrality that the wealthy of that resort can engender?
So can you repeat your question? I'm not sure I understand the question.
Yeah, so I guess I'm wondering, in the face of that inequality, right? I mean, we're talking about fixing inequality through some processes, and that's obviously going to require money, right? You know, you spoke about economics being kind of part of this as well. And I guess I'm wondering, when so much wealth is already in the hands of such a few, right, who perhaps in the opinions of some of us have very neoliberal views on how to improve things, how can we counteract that, you know, just the fact that those people have that wealth, and that kind of shifts, I guess, to use the language of their presentations today, the amount of power that you know, most of us have to act.
I'll jump in quick. I mean, for me, I think doing this work, it could be exhausting sometimes. It is an uphill battle. You're going to have barriers. There's going to be good days and bad days. I think it starts with figuring out who you are. Where do you stand in the spectrum of power and privilege, and then try to mobilize, right? That's going to be different for me, for you, for others, right? Depending on what's your identity, what makes you feel alive, what's your passion. But never forget, you know, a lot of us, for example, got here because someone else helped open a door perhaps for us. So you might mentor people, you might, you know, if you have siblings and so forth. So I always say we might not be able to change the world, which, you know, reading those stats, you get really down, right? But you can change someone's world. And if, I mean, it sounds cliche in a sense, right? But if everybody kind of does those things, and I think it goes back to what we've spoken about, the youth leading the charge, because at some point you say you've had enough, and the same old excuses don't work, right? Like, go to school and, you know, like, I train teachers, I teach in a faculty event, and I tell teacher candidates, you can't, if a student asks you, why should I listen to you? The days are over where you just say, because I'm the teacher. That doesn't work anymore, right? So it's about relationship building. It's about, you know, hey, it's about the safety of others. It's about, you know, what are your needs? What is the root causes of those behaviors? And I think when we're talking about inequality, what are the root causes of some of these issues? You know, money alone is not going to solve it. We need to have certain voices. It has to be, you know, ecological, place-based. That's why I said sometimes on an international scale, we try to copy and paste these approaches, but it actually leads to destruction of those communities. So we have to have those marginalized voices, those voices that are historically have been excluded at the conversation. And there is no one way of doing it. Like, you can't say we need to do this in every country. It just doesn't work, right? And it's about, you know, as Dr. Eloundou, you pointed out, like, you know, each context is going to have its own mechanisms and processes. We have to kind of give the tools and allow people to run with it versus trying to dictate how for them to use the tools all the time. And I'll leave it at that.
Yeah, that's I mean, now that I understood it, it's a pretty powerful question. But I have to say I'm of two minds. in my views of the 1% and how they matter. There's no question that if you consider power and their potential for destruction and disruption, and power in the realm of politics and so forth, there's an overwhelming capacity to change the world for everybody else, sometimes for the worse. But I was taken by your play, Dr. Fatnassi, on the notion of sort of the producers and consumers of culture. And I think there's great power that should be harnessed in that sort of big demographic. Essentially, the more you have this concentrated at the top, it means the sort of the rest, the 99% of the population is together. So if you create a culture that sets a different consumption values in terms of different lifestyles and what is going to be valued and so forth, of course, recognizing the potential for disruption that comes from the top, you can create an existence that is not fixated on the 1%, right? The other reaction that I have is I think the fixation of the 1% sometimes takes us off the hook, those of us who are in the 60th percentile or the 70th percentile. The minute you are on the 51st percentile, you have an obligation to lead by example. And I very much like what Dr. Eizadirad was saying about, just what do you do where you are and with the resources you have? What do you do within your communities and around you? This is not just, again, it's not one versus the other. It gives you ammunition to understand processes and to have practice and effect change on a bigger scale. And in returning to the videos that you showed early in the case of Tunisia, where people can see successful examples of claiming rights or negotiating inequality. And so through this daily practice, the rest of us can put ourselves in a better position to address sort of the top 1% and so forth. But it really starts with all of us seeing this as our collective responsibility.
I think it kind of comes back to something Dr. Eizadirad said about the triple Ps, the power, privilege, and profit, especially and I mean, we see it all the time in a country like the US that is run by capitalism, that in some areas sort of is worships capitalism. The dollar is all important and you vote with your money. And I think, it becomes very centric, and we do push a lot of, at the very least, Western ideas in the global community. So our fixation on money pushes it to others and kind of forces this idea that of the relationship between power and profit, which exists, but it doesn't always have to, and there are other tools that can be just as effective if you know how to utilize them.
Yeah. I might want to jump in on what you were. I think this conversation really fascinated me for a couple of reasons. The first is that I wonder, historically, right? So I think we should situate this historically. If we're looking at the trajectory that you were mentioning in your examples, Dr. Eloundou, looking at the 1950s to 2020, I think we could also map on, modernization theory, and this might actually even talk to what you were speaking to, Dr. Eizadirad. I think even education becomes a part of this, right? So, the 1950s, the U.S. was coming out of, industrial warfare, mechanizing the society produced these machines that led to, material culture also taking off. And so that, that wealth with the, the rise of TV and these media technologies, I think really engendered what you were talking about, right? People seeing themselves as being competitive with others in the nation. And then I think you're right, the 2000s, for me as somebody living through them in my youth, I was keeping up with the Kardashians, maybe not directly, but that pattern of consumption was my gauge for how well I was doing, right? And how, my parents don't have a remote, so we're not, we're not really up there, but I think your point kind of sticks. in that, and this is where I connect the two presentations, there's always been a bit of direct inequality, right? The inequality that I think we all see and recognize and would call out, right? And I think one of you mentioned, I can't remember who, but like inequality, I know it when I see it, right? I think the piece that we're really fighting today, and the piece that perhaps is eluding us, maybe even in this conversation, are the structural and cultural pieces, right? And, you know, I think about this in terms of violence. So, you know, Johann Galtung gave the great example of like violence is just the absence of peace, right? So inequality is just the absence of equality, right? So direct inequality is the absence of a direct equality, direct, you know, and you can kind of see, I think, maybe the connections to the 3 Ps that were discussed earlier. But I guess I'm wondering how you all would map history onto your examples, and is there potentially a future beyond COVID where, I don't know, maybe that pandemic, you know, discussion does play into factors of equity, or maybe, you know, the changing fate of K through 12 and higher ed, you know, re-equitizes the playing field. I guess I'm wondering, do you think we're at a point in history where how we conceive of inequality and how we conceive of getting equality might change? And I apologize for asking such questions at 6:30 on a Monday.
For me, I think we have to drastically change the structure. It's like, you know, I sit on a lot of committees these days related to equity, diversity, inclusion, because that's a priority in many institutions right now for different reasons, for performative, for their identity. And it's like, you know, I think people have tried to take on racism 50 years ago, 100 years ago, right? Like it's not a thing new. It's not that we're saying, oh, we weren't aware of racism. Like, yeah, we are aware of it. So if we're trying the same approach of like, let's spark a committee, the committee is gonna give us a couple recommendations, and then it's gonna go to the person higher than the committee. They're gonna debate it, and it's gonna, like, the hierarchy has to be disrupted in the first place for me, if we're going to do this in a meaningful way. And part of that is who gets invited to the table, right? If it's people who only have the power and have only made the decision making, they're making the final say without any accountability, then I don't want to sit on a committee, do all this work, the report collects dust. And that, unfortunately for me, that's what like the issues we're dealing with now, I guarantee you, in all our institutions and all the fields, there's a report 50 years ago with the exact same recommendations collecting dust somewhere. So so why am I going to reinvent the recommendation? Let's actually say how. Goes back to the how part. We don't agree on the how part. Let's actually get into talking about, we know what needs change. Let's start talking about how are we going to do it? Who's going to be part of this? How are we going to hold people accountable? And I think I'll leave it at that.
Right. It's really a very provocative question, and you need more than 10 seconds or even 30 seconds to think about it. But history, the connection between history and inequality are actually pretty profound. I think for most of the literature where I've seen, you actually have 2 historical scenarios. One is sort of a bell-shaped pattern of inequality, ebb and flow, natural progression through technological advance and adoption of modernization, essentially, or up and crash, which is, you know, you go through the Gilded Age and then you have, you know, sort of massive social upheavals, and hopefully we get another social crisis soon that, you know, sort of sets the table apart again. And so that's the first way to think to see it, you know, just through the lens of the historical experience. To your question about the current times, you know, just history as the current times, and whether there's anything in today's environment and thinking that could provide an avenue to think differently about inequality. It's really difficult if you just focus on the means. But what is clear is that the forms of inequality are mutating big time, and they're mutating both spatially. I think, as some of my slides were showing here, you have a global elite that is no longer confined to sort of, it's not a nation to nation comparison. You have this global elite that is sort of spread throughout the entire world. You have different forms of exclusion, very subtle yet equally powerful. Once you address the naming question that Eizadirad was talking about, then you're going to have another form of exclusion. When you start, sort of whitewashing, quote unquote, the names and making it acceptable to treat Samir as, on equal footing as Matthew, then you're going to have another form that is going to creep up. You're going to have new forms of microaggression and micro-exclusion. And so it's something that is really protean in its sort of manifestations and disguise. It doesn't mean, and also, unfortunately, you have sort of consequences. I don't know if it's just discovery or just new consequences that are emerging. The literature on how severe inequality is and a sense of relative deprivation for health, mental health is just alarming. And so I'm afraid I don't have sort of a happy story to tell about, sort of people coming to term and seeing the light. I tend to see inequality, just getting worse and worse. And the trend you were describing in this book, to me makes a lot of sense. It has a natural stopping point at one, but I have a hard time seeing how sort of we can achieve a quick redress.
I really appreciate both of your comments. I mean, I think what stood out for me the most about all of our presentations was we're all really thinking in the same space. And I think we're all from different disciplinary backgrounds. So what's nice to me is kind of really what you just said, the fact that it's kind of a slippery thing, inequality, in the sense of like when you grasp one part of it, another part of it goes somewhere else. And so perhaps, my understanding from the day is that we all need to work on the processes of inequality in our own domains, and that all of us working in those processes will hopefully engender enough change so that inequality becomes a thing that is really, fringe, right? Something that really exists in certain margins that haven't been heterogenized, if I could, or, certain margins that haven't been brought into this communal discourse.